My name is Leonard Marcus. I'm the co-director of the National Preparedness Leadership Initiative, a joint program of the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and the Harvard Kennedy School of Government Center for Public Leadership.
And I'm Eric McNulty, the associate director of the NPLI. Now, Lenny, I know you'll remember this day well. It was April 15th, 2013, 2:49 p.m. Explosion of rock at the finish line of the Boston Marathon. 11 seconds later, about 100 yards to the west, a second bomb went off. Chaos erupted. And then the response was remarkable. There were 3 people unfortunately killed instantly, 264 wounded. Those 264 who were injured were evacuated within 22 minutes. They were distributed evenly across the trauma centers around Boston. They all survived. 102 hours later, the incident concluded. One suspect was dead, the other was in custody. Over that week, we saw amazing cooperation and collaboration between public agencies as well as between the public sector, the private, and the nonprofit sector. And of course, in typical NPLI mode, we jumped right in and started doing our research.
So what we do is when crises happen, we will go out to the field to be with leaders in the midst of those crises. So you and I were flying out over the Deepwater Horizon oil spill back in 2010. We were down at the CDC during H1N1, and we've been to Washington interviewing leaders there. This was the first crisis of this nature that was literally in our own backyard. So we started interviewing the leaders, and the way that we conducted the interviews is, it's 2:45, now 4 minutes before the bombing, where are you? And then we walked through step by step their experience over the week, trying to understand what happened and also trying to understand why it happened.
And what emerged was really, I think, quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it took us a few months to get those interviews set up and executed. We talked to the governor, to the mayor, several people at the Boston Police Department, state police, all the agencies involved, as well as the Boston Athletic Association and others. And I remember this. We were sitting with Rick Delorier, the special agent in charge from the FBI. It was one of the later interviews.
Right.
And we asked him about the decision to keep the subway open. That was a big decision that immediate moments after the bombs went off.
Right.
Was, is it safer to keep them open or to close them? What are you going to do?
And the problem was there were almost 1 million people that were convened in Boston, and if they closed the subway system because they were concerned about another bombing, they would have been stuck there. But if they put them in the subway, there could have been another bomb on the subway.
That's right. They were very cognizant of Madrid and London.
Right.
The transportation targets are often used by terrorists. And so, and the decision was made to keep them open. And I remember you asked Rick and said, so tell us, where were you when the decision was made to keep the subway open? And he said, I wasn't there. What do you mean you weren't there? You were in charge. And he said, well, I was in charge of the investigation, but I wasn't in charge of the operation. And he said, so who was in charge of the operation? And he had a long pause, and he said, I guess no one. And that was simply remarkable. We had never seen that before.
And interestingly, we were perplexed, and he was perplexed, and that really began this inquiry into how could we explain that phenomenon.
Yeah, and so we thought about it and really wrestled with it, looked in the literature, and of course the standard answer is always there's someone in charge. There's a hierarchy, there's a command system, and other events we had looked at, be it Deepwater or Katrina or any of the others, there was always someone in charge. Mm-hmm. Now, this is somewhat by accident, somewhat serendipitous, but in my spare time, I'm a birder, and I go watch birds. And one of the amazing phenomena in the bird world is something called murmuration. And that's where starlings, hundreds, sometimes thousands of them, engage in these really intricate aerial ballets. If you go to YouTube and put in murmuration, you'll see some great video shots of these. And these enormous flocks of birds swoop in and out and around, but there's no ballet master, there's no choreographer, there's no handbook, there's no plan. They just do it. And that's when we discovered the body of science known as swarm intelligence. And that's scientists who look at non-human species who engage in complex social behaviors. Look at bees, they look at ants, they look at fish, any number of species that achieve complex social outcomes without having a hierarchy of someone being in charge and ordering people to do what to do. And we discovered there are 3 foundational principles. The first is there has to be a structure. So there has to be a swarm or a flock or a school, a group where the individuals feel a collective identity, right? They're part of something. Then secondly, there are communication protocols. So they are able to communicate with each other. Ants do it with pheromones, bees do it with waggle dances, but they are able, one individual, to communicate to the other. They're able to transmit social cues, and they follow simple rules, for example, in making decisions. So when ants dynamically allocate labor to different parts of the colony after a storm or when they're gathering food, there's no debate, there's no committee or task force formed to figure out how to do it. They know what to do, and they take these cues and the external cues from the environment, and they make decisions and they adapt their behavior. So that's where we launched off asking, could these principles of swarm intelligence apply to humans in leadership positions?
So I'll never forget the moment. I was literally pouring through the interview notes, and you walked into my office and said swarm intelligence.
And you thought I was joking.
Yeah. And so well, what is that? And what was fascinating, just at that moment, what was coming clear was that there was order beyond control. That these people were working together so well, they developed an order amongst themselves, but nobody was in control. Nobody was in charge of that overall operation. So in reading up on swarm intelligence, then went back through the notes and was trying to discover where there might have been consistent principles that could be called swarm intelligence that existed among the leaders of the Boston Marathon response. And what we found first, and this came out in all of the interviews, was the unity of mission. It was all about save lives. And whether that manifests itself in rushing people to the hospital, making sure they were taken care of by clinicians, moving forward in the investigation so there couldn't be a repeat. It was all save lives. That came out clearly in all of the interviews. So number one, unity of mission. Number two, generosity of spirit and action. Everybody that was there to help one another. So among all the different agencies, everybody stayed in their lane, did their job, and then helped others succeed. And the most interesting phenomenon that we saw was on the last day of that week when there was a manhunt going on in Watertown. All of the leaders were at a command center in a Home Depot parking lot, and they were taken care of with food, water, and bathroom facilities. And one of the people we interviewed said, and at the end of the day, he realized that all of those guys in tactical gear out in the neighborhoods doing those house-to-house searches had no food, water, or bathroom facilities. So that perplexed us. So we investigated, and it turned out they had all the food and water and bathroom facilities they needed because they went into somebody's house to do a search. People said, hey guys, can we make you sandwiches here? You need some water, use our bathroom. So that pervaded throughout the response, and nobody asked them to do that. They just did it. It was a natural response. The third principle was everybody staying in their lanes, doing their jobs, and ensuring that other people didn't take over. The fourth principle, no ego, no blame. It's not to say that all the behavior was perfect, but nobody got up and said, I did it, or took credit for it for themselves, and nobody was going around pointing fingers at others. And the fifth principle was a foundation of trusting relationships. These people really knew one another. They had drilled and exercised together. Many of them had grown up professionally together, and so they trusted one another. And what we discovered was those 5 principles were consistent across our interviews. So then we went back to the people we interviewed, and I called up Rick Deloria, the special agent in charge of the FBI. He was in charge of the investigation. I said, Rick, this is what we came up with. And his response was, Lenny, this describes exactly what we were doing, though I wasn't aware of it at the time. And that was our aha regarding how swarm intelligence and the behaviors and the interactions of these leaders actually did line up with one another. The bottom line was order beyond control, the same thing that the ants and the bees and the birds have.
And I remember we had that aha when we began to go out and present this material, take it to symposia, take it into the classroom, and share this. And we instantly got some pushback. People were very intrigued and thought, wow, this is kind of cool, but there was pushback. The first thing was they said, well, are you saying we should get rid of chain of command? We said, no, actually, the chains of command within the individual agencies and organizations worked really well, and that was important. So Boston Police, Mass State Police, Fire, EMS, those chains of command worked really well. And then technically, the governor was in charge. However, again, because I think that foundation of trusted relationships, he didn't try and be the out front operational commander. Right. He deferred to the state police, to Boston police. He deferred to the mayor within the city. Mm-hmm. And so he didn't need to assert himself as I'm in charge. In fact, he often said, how can I be useful? How can I be helpful? And then people would say, well, this was Boston, that's different. Or this was a bombing. It's easy to have unity of mission after a bombing. Well, yes, it is. But then in the 102 hours afterwards, when there's a manhunt, you've got a lot of uncertainty. In other similar situations, we've seen lots of conflict between agencies. People are not on the same page. They're afraid who's going to get blamed. They're worrying about who's going to get the credit. There's a lot of worry over the optics. In this case, none of that was there. We began to dig deeper, and we were looking for an opportunity for someone to actually try this proactively. So rather than retrospectively, someone saying, yeah, that's what we did, we didn't know we were doing it, how about this is what we're going to do, and we're going to do it intentionally?
The other piece of pushback that we've gotten is that people will say, well, yeah, this happened during a crisis during the Boston Marathon, but it doesn't exist anywhere else. So then we started an inquiry to see if there are other examples of swarm, and as we were studying it, we came to the realization, well, humans are very social animals. And we do cohere in groups. We do that to protect ourselves. We do that because of family links and because of identity links. And so what we then discovered is that many times a faith-based organization can be operating like a swarm with those principles in place. A large extended family can operate like a swarm. And then we started looking at sports teams, especially the difference between ones that really win, where they're really working together, whereas others where it's just who's the superstar.
Right.
And so, as we've been studying this, we find that swarm phenomenon among humans manifests itself in all sorts of different ways, including during times of crisis, because that's when people feel most vulnerable and they most want to come together. The flip side of that is we're also discovering that the bad guys also swarm.
Yeah.
So ISIS is a swarm. Al-Qaeda is a swarm. And I was speaking with one of the leaders of the counterterrorism community in Washington, and I said, what if you have a swarm up against bureaucracies, the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and other bureaucracies? So it's a swarm against bureaucracies. Who wins? And he paused for a moment, and he said, the swarm. And that's because the swarm can adapt and find gaps among the bureaucracies and then target right there. So in part, this sensibility can be applied by law enforcement and intelligence agencies as a way of understanding the bad guys and also as a way of providing a countervailing balance against them.
And that goes back to one of your earlier points about order beyond control. Because one of the things that distinguishes a swarm from a traditional hierarchy is that the hierarchy really is built for control. Mm-hmm. When you look at how we establish them in organizations, it really is about, I've got so much authority, my boss has more authority, the person below me has less, and we're controlling information, we're controlling decisions. Imagine like a machine, right? And certain parts of the machine can do certain things. The swarm is all about flow, and it's all about order. And we are clear about our objective and how can we in real time adapt both our form and our function to achieve that outcome, and how do we do it with as little friction as possible. And that's why, while a bureaucracy has its strengths at times, it will be slow, it can be cumbersome, and that swarm is not. It goes really fast.
So what we're fascinated with right now is in teaching this to various groups, how swarm manifests itself in a variety of different settings. So during the recent hurricanes, as is our custom at the NPLI, went out to Houston to study what was going on there among the leaders and stopped by with Kevin Hannes, who was the federal coordinating officer of FEMA for the Texas response. And he said, I'll give you an example of swarm. The Army Corps of Engineers had to open an aqueduct that was cracking, flooding neighborhoods that weren't expecting to be flooded. And so all of a sudden, thousands of homes were underwater, thousands of people needed to be evacuated, and the scale of that response exceeded what the emergency response agencies had. And as he explained it, all of a sudden, what appears? The Cajun Navy, a group of volunteers. And the Cajun Navy had no admirals, had no ships. It was just people in kayaks and rowboats and motorboats out there to help other people who were in need. And what he said is they acted like a swarm, along the lines of the principles that we mentioned. He said all we needed to do was add one more rule to make it work. And the rule was don't drop anyone off where they can't be rescued. So don't take someone from their home and then put them on a bridge that's surrounded by water. Take them into a place where we can move them to a shelter. He said, once we had those lines of communication that you mentioned, the structure between the Cajun Navy, who had radios, and the formal organizations, those open lines of communication, and one single rule. He said there wasn't one instance where they had that problem. So leaders can apply these principles and adapt them to a whole set of scenarios, whether it's in a time of crisis or whether it's part of everyday work.
Simple rules and social cues. That's what it takes. That's what Kevin did in Texas. And I think it's important to note as we close here that Swarm is wonderful, Swarm is good. Swarm is hard. It's hard in part because we humans do have egos. We do have mortgages. We do have careers, and there are politics within organizations. If you violate any one of those 5 behavioral principles you mentioned, the swarm can fall apart.
Right.
It takes adherence to those. The rules are simple. The behaviors are pretty straightforward, but you've got to adhere to them, and if you do, you can swarm, and if you don't, it can all fall apart.
Exactly.
Thank you very much.
Yes.